Hi, everybody, and welcome to our Sea Turtle and Coastal Conservation webinar. I'm going to ask our panelists to turn their cameras on now, and we'll do some introductions and then get going. So welcome again. My name is Emma Olmos. I am the Conservation Events Coordinator for Alachua Conservation Trust. I'm joined by Erica Hernandez, who is the Conservation Director of Alachua Conservation Trust, as well as Tonya Long from the Florida Fish and Wildlife Conservation Commission, and Rachel Tai from the Sea Turtle Conservancy. So just a little bit of background about ACT. Our mission is to protect the natural, scenic, historic, and recreational resources in and around North Central Florida. We protect lands through acquisition, donation, and conservation easements in 16 counties in North Central Florida. Tonight is a presentation that is part of ACT's Keep Florida Wild virtual series. If you would like to support future environmental education programming like tonight's talk, a donation can be made by texting Florida Wild to 44321. We appreciate your support. That's also going to be in the chat. There will also be a Q&A session following tonight's presentation. So if you have any questions during the webinar, you can submit them through the Q&A option at the bottom of your screen. And I'm going to get into some introductions. So Tonya Long will be speaking first. She is a fish and wildlife biologist for the Florida Fish and Wildlife Conservation Commission. Tonya received both of her undergraduate and master's degrees at the University of Central Florida while doing research in the Archie Carr National Wildlife Refuge. For the last 15 years, she has worked in sea turtle research and management all around Florida. Tonya has been with FWC since 2012 and has spent most of her career with the agency focusing and evaluating and minimizing the impacts of artificial lighting on sea turtles. Next to speak after Tonya will be Rachel Tai. She is the lighting projects manager for the Sea Turtle Conservancy and has worked with the organization for nearly 5 years. Rachel is a certified lighting specialist in the lighting industry through the National Association of Innovative Lighting Distributors. She received her Bachelor's of Science from the University of Central Florida and her Master's of Science in Biology with a strong focus in coastal ecosystems and marine ecology from the University of North Florida. Rachel has worked for environmental and conservation-driven organizations for over 12 years with a focus in minimizing the anthropogenic threats to wildlife and the natural world. Rachel currently oversees all aspects of the Sea Turtle Conservancy's lighting projects and strives to be a resource in keeping and seeking to become more sea turtle friendly. And lastly, from ACT, we have Erica Hernandez, who is our conservation director. She joined ACT in the spring of 2019 after spending a year camping across the Western US and Canada. Erica has spent her career researching flora and fauna across the state of Florida and earned her master's in interdisciplinary ecology from the H.T. Odom Center of Wetlands at the University of Florida. From deep interior swamps and estuary ecosystems to Santo and rare communities like Florida Dry Prairie, Erica loves to be neck deep in the mud or crawling around the saw palmetto, looking for Florida's rich ecological heritage. Erica has been a public servant for state agencies and public universities for over 20 years, often collaborating on complex projects requiring large stakeholder participation. In her personal time, Erica can be found foraging for wild fruit or blacksmithing. So, to begin, I'm going to turn it over to Tonya, and she's going to share her screen and tell you a little bit about sea turtles.
Excellent, thank you. Let me just share my screen here for you. All right, so thanks everyone for being here. I'm Tonya Long. I'm with the Marine Turtle Management Program with Florida Fish and Wildlife. And a lot of the work that our program focuses on is understanding and minimizing threats to sea turtles, particularly on the nesting beach. And that lines up really well with Alachua Conservation Trust's work with conservation easements. So I thought that this would be a really good opportunity to kind of talk about some of the major threats to sea turtles on the nesting beach and how conservation easements help to address some of those issues. So we have 5 species of sea turtles that nest in Florida. The 3 on the top are our most common ones. Those are loggerheads, leatherbacks, and green turtles. But we do see some Kemp's Ridley and some hawksbill nesting as well. But the main thing to note about all of these species is that they're all either threatened or endangered. So that means they are all protected at the federal, state, and local levels. And that means that there are, conservation activities occurring all across Florida from state governments, local governments, NGOs, nonprofit groups, universities. Sea turtle conservation in Florida is a huge, huge effort. So just to give you a little bit of background information on our nesting beaches here in Florida, our nesting season for most of the state runs from May 1st to October 31st, unless you are in Brevard County through Broward County. And in that case, the nesting season begins in March. And that's because that's where we have the majority of our leatherback nesting. So basically any sandy beach in Florida is considered nesting habitat. We see nesting all across the state, and the only areas of shoreline where we don't see turtle nesting are those areas like the Big Bend region where the shoreline is very marshy and you don't have nice sandy beaches. So pretty much any beach in Florida is nesting habitat. And females are going to return to the same sort of general areas time after time in order to nest. So it's really important to make sure that those beaches are maintained as good nesting habitat because females are going to keep coming back to it. What a lot of people don't know about turtles in Florida is how important we are in terms of global sea turtle populations, particularly with regard to loggerheads. Florida is the largest loggerhead nesting beach in the world. We get right around 40% of all loggerhead nests in the world right here in Florida. So, a lot of people will say, well, I don't really understand why we have to, put all these protections in place because turtles are everywhere. Well, that's true in this particular location, and that's because we have a globally important population of loggerheads. So that puts a lot of responsibility on us to make sure that we are maintaining that nesting habitat. Because if our population in Florida here starts to tank, then that has major implications for worldwide populations of loggerheads. With regard to green turtles, we have started seeing an exponential increase in green turtle nesting in recent years, which is really exciting, but also that means that that population is becoming more and more important, particularly regionally and in the Western Hemisphere. So again, it's important to make sure that we maintain those populations and we maintain good nesting habitat for those populations, because if those populations start to decline, then that that really affects the worldwide population of those species. So there are several threats, lots of threats that hinder our ability to recover those species. And some of them are things that people are quite familiar with, and some of them might be a little more foreign to folks. Things like artificial lighting, entanglement in all kinds of things, both on the nesting beach and in the water. Ingestion of debris is a big one. I know a lot of people have seen, in particular, posts on Facebook and social media about plastic in the stomachs of sea turtles. So, pollution and ingestion of any sort of foreign debris is a major issue. Disease is one that maybe a lot of folks don't think about, but that really can have an impact on large populations of turtles. And of course, habitat loss is always a threat to nesting. So the great thing about conservation easements is that they have an ability to address lots of these threats kind of in one fell swoop. So as I mentioned at FWC, we work really hard on managing these different threats and finding ways to minimize those threats to sea turtles through all kinds of different programs, through coordination and work with local governments, through monitoring of various factors during nesting season. So we have a lot of programs going on to try and address some of these threats. But again, conservation easements, because they are including so many components, they're able to really provide a direct benefit to sea turtles because they are specifically reducing some of those threats. So what I want to sort of spend the rest of this time doing is to kind of go through some of the major threats to sea turtles on the nesting beach and talk about how the restricted activities listed in conservation easements can help address some of those threats. And as I mentioned, the list of threats can be exhaustive, and there are quite a number of things that can be included in an easement. So I'm not going to get to every one of them, but I do want to talk about some of the main ones and kind of illustrate why those things are important for sea turtles in Florida. So one of the big ones is artificial lighting, and this is one that probably a lot of people that live in coastal areas of Florida are very much familiar with. And I'm not going to go into a ton of detail about lighting specifically because you're going to hear more about that from Rachel in just a few minutes. But the idea here is that conservation easements will require that you use turtle-friendly lighting. And the reason is to help reduce instances of disorientation where turtles are going the wrong way. And that can happen with nesting females or hatchlings. Having inappropriate lighting can cause them to wander around, wander off the beach, and end up in some of these really precarious situations that you can see on the slide here. Turtles in the roadway, turtles being eaten by various other wildlife, and all sorts of situations that we don't want them to be in. So by including provisions for turtle-friendly lighting, that helps to reduce that instance of disorientation. The other thing is that nesting females can be deterred completely from nesting by very bright lights. So in addition to helping to prevent those disorientation events, you're also improving the habitat and helping to maintain good, suitable nesting habitat where nesting females can come and nest rather than being deterred by having really bright artificial lighting on the beachfront. Another restriction is on vegetation removal. And this, in part, sort of ties back to what we just talked about with lighting. So dune vegetation is a really, really effective barrier to beachfront lighting that might be visible from the beach. So having a really nice, lush, well-vegetated dune can help block some of that light, and therefore it helps to reduce those occurrences of disorientations. So you can see from the photos here, just by removing some of that dune vegetation, this commercial building becomes very, very bright when you're standing on the beach. And so that's a situation that could really cause some major impacts to turtles that might be nesting in that area. The other thing is that having that vegetation there helps to hold the sand in place. So by removing that vegetation, you are removing some of the components that help to maintain a nice stable dune. And so when you don't have that stabilization in the dune, you run the risk of having things like erosion degrade the habitat because nests now are more susceptible to things like being washed out. So this is sort of a twofold benefit here, because you're reducing disorientations. You're also helping to maintain a really nice, healthy dune system. So physical obstructions are something that can really cause issues for turtles, and this is something that we see way, way too frequently. So having a restriction on physical obstructions basically just means you should be taking your stuff off of the beach when you're done for the day. It means not leaving things like beach chairs or umbrellas or tents out on the beach overnight. And you can see if there's a lot of this kind of equipment that's left out on the beach, such as in the photo on the left, that can actually sometimes create a complete physical barrier for a turtle that's trying to nest. Particularly if this equipment is down kind of close to the water, you've essentially cut off the turtle from being able to reach the appropriate part of the nesting beach to lay a nest. The other risk that you run is with turtles getting entangled or entrapped in that kind of material. And you can see in that photo on the right, that's exactly what's happened. That's a nesting female that was trapped under a stack of beach chairs. She ended up getting under there as she was trying to nest, became stuck, and the nesting surveyors found her in the morning and had to obviously remove those beach chairs so that she could make her way back to the water. So thankfully, this situation had a happy ending and there wasn't any harm to the turtle. But we've absolutely seen plenty of situations where a turtle might get stuck on something and then they drag a beach chair or the canopy from an umbrella or some other debris along with them for potentially hundreds of feet as they're crawling around the beach. And sometimes they may be able to get themselves free and sometimes they may not, which means now they're swimming out to, swimming out in the ocean with something like a beach chair, stuck on a flipper or something like that. So those entanglement and entrapment risks can create a really serious situation for a turtle, in addition to cutting them off from being able to access good nesting habitat. So by taking all of those obstructions off the beach at night, you're allowing the turtle to have a nice, clean, open, area for nesting that's not going to pose any hazards. So driving on the beach is probably one that might not immediately come to mind as something that might be an issue, particularly if you live in an area where recreational driving on the beach is not allowed. But there are several areas where this is allowed. And in lots of other places, vehicles are allowed on the beach for things like trash pickup or various other things. So we do see some issues from time to time. One of the obvious threats from driving on the beach is running over a nest, or even worse, running over a turtle. But nests are not always very obvious. They're not always marked. There are lots of areas of the state where every single nest doesn't get, stakes and barrier tape, so you wouldn't know that it's there. So driving on the beach, you run the risk of running over a nest and crushing it. But also, particularly if it's an area where you might be driving back and forth over the same stretch over and over again, that can start to cause compaction in the sand, which makes it really difficult for a turtle to dig when she's trying to dig her nest. So you end up degrading the habitat because that sand is really difficult for turtles to dig in, and it may cause them to just abandon the nesting attempt altogether. The other issue that we see, particularly with hatchlings, which is what we're showing in the photo here, is that the ruts that get left behind by vehicles can often cause disorientation in hatchlings. This is sort of the one non-lighting related issue that will cause disorientation, because hatchlings, as they're crawling to the water, end up getting into these ruts and they can't get back out. So you might have hatchlings crawling for hundreds of feet potentially, which is quite a long way for a new hatchling, until they can find a spot where they can get out of those ruts. And that can be really dangerous for them because they end up being exhausted, dehydrated, etc. And that makes it tough for them to then swim offshore, to have the energy to be able to do that. Shoreline armoring is probably one that is no surprise to people. And again, there are a few reasons why shoreline armoring can cause a problem. And so there are several reasons why this would be something that would be a restricted use in a conservation easement. The obvious threat here is that these types of armoring cause a barrier to nesting. So a turtle's crawling up trying to find a dune and they run into a seawall. So it creates a physical barrier to being able to nest. And you can see here that in both of these photos, the turtle will hit the obstruction and then often just keep trying to find a place where they can get around it. And many times that is unsuccessful. The other thing is that similar to removing dune vegetation, because you don't have a root system there to help hold sand in place, you end up with degraded habitat because you're susceptible to things like erosion, because the seawall or the rocks don't do as good a job of holding that sand in place, and therefore you can end up with nests being washed out. So this is one that might not be super obvious to people, but it's having loose pets on the beach. And this video is sort of an extreme example of one of the reasons why this is something that would be restricted, and that's actual physical harassment of the turtle. You can see here there were some dogs loose on the beach that came and crowded around this turtle as she was coming up to nest. And obviously that is very distressing for a turtle if you're trying to find a nice quiet nesting spot. So she promptly turned around and went back to the water. So that's sort of an obvious potential problem with unleashed pets. If, let's say, a dog or a cat comes across hatchlings on the beach, you run the risk of predation, because just about any wildlife or domesticated animals that make it to the beach and find hatchlings will feed on them. So that's another risk that's run with having loose pets. The other thing is that dogs often like to dig. I know mine sure do. So you have the potential for dogs to dig up turtle nests, particularly if they've just been laid and there's a lot of good turtle smell still in the area. And that is obviously very damaging for those nests. So kind of the common thread that I hope has become sort of obvious through all of these examples is that protecting the habitat helps to protect the turtles. And so the conservation easements do a really good job of multiple habitat protections. And so by sort of compiling all of those together, it helps to really reduce a lot of those threats that we are working at the state level to try and manage. So there's a lot more information on all the work that FWC does. You can go to myfwc.com/seaturtle and see a lot of information about the various things that we do at the state level to also manage some of these threats, like lighting on the beach and shoreline armoring and so forth. So I just want to thank you all again for being here. And I look forward to taking any questions later in the webinar.
Thank you, Tonya. And now we're going to pass it on to Rachel to talk to you a little bit more about lighting.
All right, let me just share my screen. Okay. Thank you so much for having me today. You're going to hear me say at the beginning of this presentation, I'm going to reiterate some of the things that Tonya is saying and further drive home why, one, sea turtles are so important. But first, I wanted to tell you a little bit about Sea Turtle Conservancy and why I'm talking about what I'm talking about. So Sea Turtle Conservancy is the oldest sea turtle organization in the world. We're a nonprofit organization based in Gainesville, Florida. We were founded in 1959 by Dr. Archie Carr, who's photographed here. Since our founding, our research and conservation initiatives have been instrumental in saving the Caribbean green turtle from immediate extinction, and as well as raising awareness and protection for sea turtles across the globe with over 60 years of experience in national and international sea turtle conservation, research, and educational endeavors. So in addition to this research, education, outreach, and advocacy and policy, we also work to preserve nesting beaches by the use of sea turtle friendly lighting. So this is where I'm going to reiterate some of the things that Tony said just to further drive this home. But to start with, it's first important to understand the extent of the problem. So sea turtles are an ancient group of reptiles that have been around for over 110 million years, which is really even older than the age of dinosaurs. And for much of this time, you have to think sea turtles were able to nest peacefully without many of the threats that they face today. So Tonya kind of already talked about a lot of these threats, most being human related, and she briefly discussed artificial light. So we're going to talk about what specifically is the problem with artificial light. So nesting and hatchling emergence usually takes place at night. Adult and hatchling sea turtles use natural cues to make their way to the ocean. And one of those main cues is to navigate while they're on the beach at night. It has to do with the relatively darker dune, creating these dark silhouettes against the night sky, which Tonya again briefly mentioned. And this screens out that celestial light. And then also the relatively brighter ocean, which actually reflects that celestial light. So the contrast between that darker dune and brighter ocean is the main way that sea turtles tell the difference between land and water. Hatchling sea turtles emerging from nests use these same cues to move towards the water and away from land. So these landward sources of light can disrupt these natural cues. So these lights are highly directional and near the horizon. This can create a lot of confusion. Adult turtles usually crawl away from bright lights. However, you see hatchlings often move towards these lights despite them being typically uphill or against gravity. And as Tony mentioned, these disorientations can oftentimes result in mortality. So this threat has the potential of drastically altering nesting numbers, which can have devastating impacts on global populations, as we've heard before. And again, as Tonya mentioned, Florida currently hosts the largest loggerhead nesting population in the world after recent declines in population numbers occurred in Oman. So again, therefore, what happens to our sea turtles and our nesting beaches greatly affects the world's populations, which is why it's so important to have these effective management strategies in the United States. So this recent decline in the Oman population numbers also suggests that populations may not be as static or stable as we originally thought, and may in fact be more fragile, further exemplifying the need for effective management strategies. So we're going to talk about what type of strategies we actually use to manage artificial light. And to do that, we're going to talk about the three rules. So over 20 years ago, the state of Florida, with help from other scientists and technical advisors, developed 3 rules that can reduce the effects of artificial light on sea turtles. And you can apply these 3 rules to your own home or property. And that first rule is to keep it low. So keep it low literally means to keep the fixture low to the ground by lowering the mounting height. The more light that can be actually focused to the ground where it's needed, the less effects it has on wildlife. So as you can see from this diagram, choosing the correct height can have a very positive impact or negative impact on wildlife. Keeping it low also means lighting what you need for safety reasons, but doing it in such a way that that source of light is lowered and actually not visible from the beach. And then keep it low can also refer to lowering watts and lumens when selecting a fixture for an application. And these are just some images of that concept of keeping it low. The next rule is to keep it shielded. So shielding is all about directing the light where it is needed rather than spreading it all around to things that actually don't need to be illuminated. So light that is not shielded actually creates a lot of light pollution. However, in this diagram, you can see as a fixture is fully shielded, the amount of light pollution actually decreases. And then this is an example of what it means to keep it shielded. On the left are some common problematic areas, so area lights such as bollards and step lights. And then on the right, you can see some well-managed sea turtle friendly alternatives to these areas that are actually shielding that source of light and aiming it away from the beach. And then the third rule is to keep it long. So to understand what we mean by keeping it long is to really understand the principles of light. We see light as white. However, visible light is actually composed of many colors, which can be viewed when light is being shown through a glass prism. Rainbows also break up this visible light into colors, being red, orange, yellow, green, blue, indigo, and violet. If you guys all remember Roy G. Biv. But if you notice, the longer arcs of the rainbow are actually red, orange, and yellow. And this is because on the electromagnetic spectrum, which is shown here, red, orange, and yellow have longer wavelengths, while violet, blue, and green have shorter wavelengths. So in this image, the top band actually depicts the entire electromagnetic spectrum, which includes all forms of electromagnetic radiation. But people are only capable of seeing a portion of this spectrum, which is known as the visible light spectrum, which is depicted on the bottom band. And shorter wavelengths range from about 400 to 550 nanometers, and long wavelengths range from about 560 to 700 nanometers. So this is important because sea turtle vision differs from our own, and that they are more attracted to short wavelengths of light and are more indifferent or aversive to longer wavelengths. So this figure demonstrates how sea turtles are attracted to different wavelengths of light. Each line represents a different species and the proportions of hatchlings that are attracted to a specific wavelength of light. So as you can see, all 4 species have a 100% attraction rate when they're exposed to short wavelength light. However, the study found that loggerhead turtles differed from other species in that they showed an aversion to light in the yellow region of the spectrum. So in practice, what this means is that when hatchlings view this light on the spectrum, they're more likely to turn away, which will help direct them back to the ocean. Other species also decrease their attraction rate when they're exposed to longer wavelengths of light, which is why we advocate for bulbs and fixtures that actually emit the spectrum that's equal or greater to 560 nanometers. So here's an example of a poorly managed white globe light on the left. This light is full spectrum, which you can see here depicted by a spectrometer graph. And then on the right, we have a well-managed light that is 560 nanometers and above. You can see the difference in the spectrometer readings on how narrow the bands actually are. And this reading is actually from a property that we evaluated that already had sea turtle friendly bulbs in the section of the property, which was fantastic. And you'll notice that that band actually peaks around 640 nanometers, which is why that light is more of an orange reddish color. Some areas in the state still allow bug bulbs, and we can talk about that a little bit more later, but to be used outdoor on the beach. And these bulbs also aren't a good solution because they're still actually full spectrum. So rather than emitting a narrow range from 560 nanometers to 700 nanometers, which is a characteristic of sea turtle friendly lighting, they emit a lot more than that. They're full spectrum, as I mentioned. And another term that you may hear that describes these is PC or phosphorus coated amber. So PC amber is not true amber. Again, it's coated, which means the wavelength of the light has not changed. So the light is still full spectrum. So just because a light appears to be sea turtle friendly doesn't actually mean that it is. So now that you know the 3 rules, I'm going to talk about the benefits of actually using sea turtle friendly lighting. So in addition to protecting sea turtles, using sea turtle friendly lighting can also help other wildlife. Artificial light actually disrupts bat foraging behavior, and many species will avoid brightly lit areas, which decreases pollination of valuable crop species. Millions of birds each year die from exhaustion or collisions near bright sources of light. Moths are especially vulnerable to artificial light and swarm to bright white sources of light and aren't able to escape. And then species such as fireflies that rely on bioluminescence for communication are losing habitat as artificial light masks or covers it up, and it covers up their signals to other fireflies. So again, using sea turtle friendly lighting will help prevent all these things happening to other species. Using sea turtle friendly lighting can also bring you into compliance with your local lighting ordinances and save you from penalties such as frequent fines that you may receive. And if you weren't aware, there are actually 86 local governments in Florida that have adopted a sea turtle friendly lighting ordinance, which they administer and enforce both for existing and new beachfront properties. The teal indicates a county that has a lighting ordinance, and the municipalities listed below each counties are those that also have lighting ordinances. And I just encourage you to check your local lighting ordinance and look at your property and see if you're actually meeting the requirements in your area. You'll also likely have better light distribution, which is much better for security, which is a great benefit. There's actually no evidence that reducing light increases crime. So a lot of people think that using a sea turtle friendly light means less light, and that's not necessarily the case. However, there is actually evidence that reducing light increases people's fear of crime. So brighter lights may actually attract vandals and burglars, drawing attention to a property and allowing them easier access. So using the right light for the right application and shielding a light can actually provide better light distribution than most white lights, which better illuminates an area and kind of prevents those deep shadows. You can also meet safety requirements such as the Florida Building Code, ADA compliance, fire marshal code using sea turtle friendly lighting. In fact, we actively work with beachfront property owners to provide adequate safety to light public areas such as stairs and exit points, parking garages, and pools. And in this particular photo, it's of a parking garage that is actually meeting building code using sea turtle friendly lighting. And it's being done without illuminating the beach and impacting sea turtles. And furthermore, you can actually see that the light is distributed equally throughout the garage without creating any of those deep shadows I mentioned, which kind of circles us back to it being good for security. Another benefit is energy savings. Keeping it low, as I mentioned before, can also mean lowering the watts and lumens. So many people use too much light for an application. So keeping the lumens down will help sea turtles and other wildlife keeping the watts down will also help you save money and energy. Sea turtle friendly lighting has been said to enhance a property's aesthetic, and it can be very attractive. And although this is slightly subjective, sea turtle friendly lighting has been described as having this sort of candlelit ambiance that gives a property this soft, almost resort style feel. And even more incentive, by using sea turtle friendly fixtures, you can also ensure that the color and distribution of the light is uniform throughout the property, since sea turtle friendly lighting falls within that narrow wavelength we discussed. So these photos are from two different areas of a recently retrofitted beachfront property, and they received a lot of positive media attention due to the final look and was actually used as a keystone property in the community to bring their neighbors aboard. Another benefit of using sea turtle friendly lighting is good for your personal health. So applying the 3 rules to your property helps you with your natural circadian rhythm and promotes better sleep. And if you recall, many types of technology that we use throughout the day, such as computers or phones, have a nighttime mode that changes the Kelvin temperature on the screen to a lower Kelvin, which is warmer and usually kind of an amber light. So while not all lower Kelvin temperature lighting products are sea turtle friendly, all sea turtle friendly lighting is a lower Kelvin temperature. So using these wavelengths and Kelvin temperatures has also been shown to improve your mood, reduce headaches, and just make you feel better throughout the day. And really, who doesn't want that? So hopefully by now I've convinced you that sea turtle friendly lighting is good and this is something that you want to do. So really the next step would be going and picking out sea turtle friendly fixtures. And you can find these fixtures on the Florida Fish and Wildlife Conservation Commission's website. There's the link shown here, or you can just Google FWC turtle lighting. So all of these fixtures and bulbs have passed a third-party rigorous test to ensure that they actually meet the 3 rules of sea turtle friendly lighting. So this is a great place to come and look. But however, just a little side note, just because a fixture isn't certified doesn't mean that it's not necessarily sea turtle friendly, as long as that fixture follows the 3 rules of keeping it low, keeping it shielded, and keeping it long. So now that you kind of know where you go look for fixtures, I want to be able to kind of close this loop and let you know where you can buy those. A lot of people reach this point and kind of get stuck and they don't really know where to go. So you can't just walk into a chain store like Lowe's or Home Depot and buy it over the counter yet anyway. It often takes time to actually receive sea turtle friendly fixtures because they're actually made to order. So you need to purchase them through a local lighting distributor, a lighting agency, or a contractor to find them. And if this is a path that you'd like to take, you're welcome to contact me or Tonya, and we'd be more than happy to share additional information with you. You can, of course, find more information about sea turtle friendly lighting on our website. There's some educational materials there that you can order or print for yourself. Our YouTube channel has a lot of information and videos there. And then I just kind of want to make a quick plug about our retrofit program. So if you have a beachfront property in Southwest Florida and you are interested in receiving resources to actually change your property to become more sea turtle friendly, we are currently evaluating new properties in Pinellas, Manatee, Sarasota, Charlotte, Lee, and Collier counties to participate in our retrofit program. We also have a smaller extension for properties located in Fort Lauderdale. So our grant allows us to cover 100% of the costs for fixtures and bulbs that are visible from the beach. However, properties are responsible for installation costs. We evaluate all types of properties, being single-family homes, vacation rentals, condominiums, restaurants that have lights that are visible from the beach and could cause potential sea turtle disorientation. So if you're interested, just contact me by email. Here's my email, and of course I'll be available for questions later during that allotted time, and I'll also be sure to put my email in the chat for you guys. And that's all I got. Thank you.
Thanks so much, Rachel. And now I'm going to pass it to Erica to talk about coastal conservation easements.
Thank you. Let's see. All right. Well, thank you so much to Rachel and Tonya for such a really fantastic introduction to the types of things that are threats to sea turtles on our Florida beaches, and maybe some of the things that we can address creatively with coastal conservation easements. And so I will specifically speak about conservation easements and how it relates back to these protections and the needs of sea turtle nesting habitat on our beaches. And so as we already heard, we have a huge population of nesting sea turtles here in Florida that's actually very important to the rest of the world. And one thing that is kind of relevant here is that so much of these nesting beaches that have all of these qualities, dark skies, intact sand dunes, intact vegetation, maybe limitations on things like beach chairs and umbrellas and things like that, those are going to be in public protected areas. But we have a lot of coastline in Florida, and most of that coastline is actually belongs to private individuals, homes, condominiums, commercial districts. So there's a gap in areas that are really stellar sea turtle nesting habitat, and then where the rest of us basically hang out and enjoy our gorgeous beaches. And so we wanted to try and look at creative ways to address these in-between spaces that are basically most of the Florida coastline, where sea turtles potentially are still nesting or are losing potential for nesting because of these threats that we've heard about tonight related to lighting and erosion, hardened shorelines, debris and structures left on the beaches, predation, and pollution. And so I'm going to take a step back and talk a little bit about property rights for private property owners. So when you own property, be it inland or on the coast, your property owner rights, we kind of call that a bundle of sticks. And so if you remove one of the sticks from this bundle, those could be parts of your property rights. So as a landowner, you own and possess your property, but you're also allowed to mortgage it. You are allowed to lease that property. You can subdivide, you can sell, you can develop. There are different types of rights like related to water and mineral rights. And so you can sell some of these different rights that you have. Folks, it's really not uncommon to have mineral rights that you sell, or there's a lot of history of that here in Florida. In some of the more interior areas. And so essentially you release some of these property rights. And so one of those things is related to the development rights of property. And so what a conservation easement is in general is a voluntary agreement, which is really a contractual agreement between a landowner and an easement holder, such as Alachua Conservation Trust. We are legally able to hold conservation easements through Florida statute, but also it could be a local government or the state. And a conservation easement is going to restrict certain property use specifically for the purpose of conservation. So I think that there's often a lot of confusion over the word easement. So especially when we're talking about coastal property, folks might think about ingress and egress as far as access to the beach. And it is the same word, it is an easement, but it really has a completely different meaning. So while an ingress and egress has to do with, accessing something related to a utility or a right-of-way, a conservation easement is about restricting certain land uses that could damage conservation value, and they're meant to perpetually protect conservation value. And so there are different ways of transferring property through a conservation easement. Sometimes they are sold, many times they are donated. As I mentioned, there are different types of entities that can be an easement holder. But essentially, it's going to be a contractual list of restrictions and allowances. What can be done on this property, what can never be done on this property. And again, it's perpetual. They are not meant to be amended or to change. It's not for an allotment of time. They're really meant to be absolutely forever. Oops. And so a conservation easement is a really unique tool because the land stays private. It stays in private ownership. It doesn't become, the government's land or Alachua Conservation Trust land. It's your land. And so you can still do a lot of the things that you'd want to do with that property, such as build your house or rent the property out or have an heir inherit the property. You can sell it. And that conservation easement is going to run with the land. So whoever owns this land in the future, this deed restriction, this contractual obligation will always be tied to that property. And it will be the entity that holds the easement, such as ourselves, that are going to be perpetually responsible for making sure that the terms of that conservation is always maintained. So sometimes with conservation easements, if they meet certain criteria, there could be tax benefits to the landowner. This is because a lot of the evaluation of property is looking at the highest and best use, which typically means development. It means that in which way can this property be most valuable? And so if you limit that development, if you say that you can't subdivide it or build it out, then you're removing something of value from the property to maintain conservation. It might be a little counterintuitive, especially because I imagine there are many sea turtle enthusiasts on this webinar today, but really that's kind of how they look at the value and determine, if you're able for a conservation easement to have benefits from your taxes as a charitable donation of value. And we'll talk about that in a little bit. Let's see. So we kind of have an unusual situation here in talking about coastal conservation easements, because often traditional conservation easements are going to be large tracts of land, and they're going to be continuous, and they're going to maybe back up to other public large spaces. Something like this image here are Florida mountains. But then we look at coastal property, and this is going to be a more likely scenario where you have homes and you have, access to the beach, and the lots are pretty small and they're incredibly valuable, easily millions of dollars. Even a small lot with a modest home is going to be quite valuable. So the idea is, how could we work with this type of property? What could we possibly restrict, and what kinds of things can we do to make a document that really benefits sea turtles? And so when we're talking about coastal conservation easements, we're going to start looking at some of these things that Tonya and Rachel were speaking about. What are directly threats to sea turtles, as well as other nesting coastal species such as shorebirds. Our conservation easements in coastal areas actually benefit both. But we start looking at what could be restricted that can benefit sea turtles. And so some of the big ones would be further subdivision, which if it's a really small lot and local code doesn't really allow for that, that one may not be such a big one. Topographic alteration is going to be related to protecting that sand dune and vegetation removal. Lighting is in there as well. And we put language into the contracts that reflects the best available science that we have from our partners like the Sea Turtle Conservancy and the Fish and Wildlife Service of what we know disrupts sea turtles in ways that we can basically put into that language what would be not allowed. But one of the really big ones, I think, is the shoreline armoring. It's the one that probably affects the property value the most. It's also one of the largest threats that we have to habitat right now. When we look at the changes in sea level, when we look at storms that come in and really scourge out the beaches, we lose that whole in-between zone, that sand habitat, that dune habitat, the vegetation, and essentially what happens is everything below that revetment, that seawall, is going to go below mean high tide. So it's just no longer appropriate for nesting, period, because it's basically covered in water twice a day. And so what's a little bit different with a coastal conservation easement is kind of related to, the value of it. A lot of coastal properties too might have mortgages. A lot of them are not necessarily the primary residence, although in Florida, sometimes folks retire here and this is where they live year round, but you might have a mortgage on that property. And then in general, it's such valuable property. You really have to approach somebody at the right time. If they think like, this is an important nest egg to me and I need to be able to maximize its resale value, they might have hesitation about restricting it, putting deed restrictions on a property. So when we're working with someone who's considering a coastal conservation easement, it's really important that you think about what that future use is, who might potentially inherit property. Sometimes we work with families where the parents are really interested in the coastal conservation easements, but their children and heirs are maybe a little concerned that having this restriction would scare off potential buyers. So as I said before, sometimes if a conservation easement can really prove this conservation value and is restricted enough to really demonstrate that it's benefiting sea turtles, then there can be this tax deduction. So under a conservation easement, it is up to 50% of the value of the conservation easement, and you can basically deduct that from income taxes for up to 15 years or until you reach the full value of the easement. So for some folks, that can be a really positive incentive if the timing is right with your finances and your income. And so another tool that we have used as well besides coastal conservation easements are called beach management agreements. And we kind of use this as an in-between tool where maybe someone is a little bit hesitant to fully commit to something that's perpetual and it's going to last forever, and instead are still really interested in being good stewards of coastal habitat. And so these are beach management agreements, and it has a lot of the same contractual language that we have in coastal conservation easements, but they're more time limited. They actually typically are in 5-year increments. Where they work best is when you actually have multiple homeowners, maybe on a stretch of beach, a homeowners association, a group of folks that can really kind of tie together multiple properties and work together. We have found a lot of success with this model down in the Florida Keys, where we've actually had some hurricane damage and a lot of erosion of nesting sea turtle beach in an area where there aren't very many sandy beaches. And so this group of folks has been working together to do sea oat plantings and restore some of the dunes, and just really have done a lot of volunteer efforts to work together. And our hope is that they can see that, a conservation easement is still kind of continuing what they're doing now, but it really protects it in the future. So we do have homeowners that see that model and are starting to consider that maybe going permanent wouldn't be so bad, because it means that this investment that they're making can potentially be protected forever. And then another creative idea that we've had is related very specifically to the lighting easement. Rachel showed us the map of where some of the ordinances are for Florida, but not all of Florida is under ordinance. And the other idea is that some of these areas, you know, it's the county government that's making these rules, and, you know, there could be a change. There could be something, you know, a redevelopment area, or, you know, some kind of change in leadership, and it just becomes, it can be changed. And so the idea is with these perpetual easements, you know, we kind of have a little bit of teeth in the game, or skin in the game, whatever the expression is, to be able to kind of back up this perpetualness to protect some of these conservation values. And so specifically, you could do one that really just focuses on the sea turtle lighting and making sure that that's always maintained and enforced. And so just to wrap it up, I think I maybe went a little too fast, but we have these 3 tools that are kind of novel in the sense that, you know, this is a new idea that we've had in the last 5 years or so. We've been working with our partners, such as the Sea Turtle Conservancy and the University Levine School of Law, as well as Fish and Wildlife and the Archie Carr Center for Sea Turtle Research, and coming up with these creative ideas to try and work with private property, keep property private, and still protect it in perpetuity for conservation for sea turtles. And so those 3 tools are the Coastal Conservation Easement, the Beach Management Agreement, and the Sea Turtle Lighting Easement. And this is my contact information, as well as Emma's, who also works on the Sea Turtle Protection Program. And go ahead and stop. Let's see, stop sharing. But if you're interested in following up with this, in looking at, you know, is your property, is there something there for us to maybe work with to restrict? One of the things that we do is we essentially have a worksheet that lists out a lot of the restrictions that go into these coastal conservation easement language. And it gives a lot of context of why the restriction is there, and it gauges the landowner's comfort level with maybe implementing that restriction on their property. So it talks about things like, you know, are you okay with keeping your dogs off the beach during nesting season? Are you going to be able to, you know, decide not to put that dock in, or not decide not to do a rock revetment or things like that, and kind of gauge that comfort level. Conservation easements on the front end are highly flexible in this kind of initial design and negotiation of what a landowner is willing to restrict and what they're not willing to restrict. But of course, you want to give it a lot of thought and put a lot of effort into considering those future uses, because once it's recorded, it is permanent. So you don't want to ever be in violation or create a scenario where, you know, your heirs are creating a violation because you didn't really think about how you wanted to use that property. You know, we're not here to convince anybody to sign up for a conservation easement. It has to be the right move for you. But you know, they're great documents, and you have a lot of input into them, and we can kind of get into those details and discuss them if you want to reach out to us. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Erica. So now we are going to move into our Q&A portion of this evening, and we're going to be wrapping up no later than 7:30. So I'm just going to get into it. If our panelists want to turn their videos back on, and we can go through some of these questions. So the first one is probably towards Tonya or Rachel, is does noise bother the turtles trying to lay during nesting season?
Okay, I see Rachel pointing at me, so I'll take that one. You know, that's a good question. I would say the thing that bothers the turtles more than noise is typically the activity that comes along with whatever's creating the noise. So most of the time, the things that we often are concerned about that are going to be big and noisy are things like fireworks displays or concerts, or, you know, I don't know, events on the beach with lots of people. So it's not necessarily the noise, it's all of the activity and the obstructions and all of that other stuff that kind of comes along with it that tends to really be the problem.
All right, thank you. And then kind of along the same thread of threats to turtles, how does human-induced climate change affect nesting sea turtles and their behavior and health and all those kinds of aspects of it?
That's a good question. That's a very complex question. And there's a lot to unpack in there. But, you know, I mean, one of the things that is probably the most obvious threat is sea level rise as a result of climate change, because it takes away nesting habitat in a very real way. And so no more nesting habitat means no more turtles. So, you know, we start to see in some areas what we call coastal squeeze. And that's because you have shorelines that are very heavily developed. So the, you know, natural progression of a shoreline as sea levels might change, shorelines on their own are naturally very dynamic. They might move inland, they might move, you know, seaward, but when you have a developed coastline, that can't happen. So as sea level rises, that habitat, you know, has the potential to disappear in a very real way. You know, there are a lot of things happening with climate change that lots of researchers in lots of places are trying to figure out. Things like, how is it impacting the incubation temperatures of nests? How is it impacting the timing of nesting? How is it impacting foraging grounds? So we certainly know that there are impacts, and there is a lot of work happening right now to try and figure out what exactly those impacts are and what we might start to see as climate change progresses.
Thank you. And this one might also be for you, Tonya, but can you speak a little bit more about disease threats to turtles and how they're impacting sea turtles and any trends that you've noticed over the past couple of years with disease particularly?
Oh, goodness. I am probably not qualified to answer that question. I am by no means a pathologist. You know, the disease that is sort of most recognizable in sea turtles is called fibropapillomatosis, which is a real mouthful, and it's a disease that causes tumors. So the photo that I showed in my presentation was a turtle that has fibropapillomatosis, as evidenced by the tumors. And again, there's still a lot that we don't know about it. There's a lot of research going on trying to understand it better, trying to understand what causes it, how it's transmitted, so on and so forth. Unfortunately, that is not my area of expertise, so I can't provide too much insight on that front.
That was great. And okay, so this one is going to kind of go towards Erica. So in terms of conservation easements on coastlines versus inland, can you talk a little bit more about why would you choose to do a conservation easement on the coastline from a land trust perspective?
Sure. So, you know, you can still have coastal protection and coastal conservation easements that still look more like a traditional conservation easement, where it's potentially a large tract of land, it's undeveloped, it's a wild space. And so those are still out there. Specifically with this program, we're really looking at, you know, smaller lots that are kind of in between. They already have houses on them. Sometimes we are fortunate and we're able to work with someone who maybe has an adjacent lot that's undeveloped. And so potentially you can put the restriction not only on your own home to kind of limit future development, but then also on this second lot that is undeveloped and keep it from being further developed. Sometimes people own lots that are undeveloped and maybe there's houses all around them and it's not very large, but that can still also be protected. But in, you know, this is a a novel program. It's fairly new, so we don't actually have many coastal conservation easements with this very specific language. We are working with several landowners and have done these workshops in the past in person. There are folks that are really interested. The thing that we have learned about coastal conservation easements and conservation easements in general is that sometimes it takes some time before you're ready to fully commit, before your things kind of align with your decision making, with your family, with your finances, to decide that you're comfortable with this restriction and permanent restriction. So we're working with many folks, but we don't necessarily have that executed document yet, except for a couple of instances. We do have several of these beach management agreements. Those are working really well. And yes, we do have much more traditional conservation easements inland, for sure.
Thank you. And then this one's also kind of going to come right back to you, Erica, which is, how does shoreline erosion factor into designing coastal conservation easements?
Yeah, so I mean, someone could decide that they're not willing to limit their ability to harden their shoreline. But then we probably wouldn't really be able to work with them, because there's not going to be a lot of conservation value left or any habitat left to protect if the decision is made to harden the shoreline. So, we would definitely try and connect someone with resources if there was some type of erosion issue. Living shorelines and building natural habitat back is really the other best way that we have, the best tool in the toolbox. Hardened shorelines, it's really tricky. In some areas, there isn't any hardened shoreline. It's all hardened shoreline. And so if you're the only lot without it, that's really tricky. Potentially your neighbors are causing erosion on your lot and vice versa. So it really depends on the front end. We have to look at what's going on that property. We have worked with owners in the past that have really suffered some pretty severe erosion. And we just decided that there just wasn't any sea turtle nesting habitat to protect because it was all below mean high tide. And it wasn't because there was any kind of shoreline hardening. It was just because they had experienced so much erosion. And in this particular instance, they backed up to a road. And so that road kind of became that barrier where the habitat just couldn't move. And so there just wasn't much to protect. And so we just realized that there just wasn't really anything we could do there. But sometimes as a land trust, we also just try and connect landowners with resources. So there are grants to try and restore habitat that are out there through our partners at the state and federal level. Also some other nonprofits and research institutions that we work with. And so there's always the possibility. So it's good just to reach out and just see what we can do. And if there's something that, we can work on together and help facilitate to protect habitat.
All right, thank you. If I just want to remind everybody that we are still able to take more questions and they can keep putting them in the chat. I'm just going to give a couple seconds to see if anybody has any last questions before we wrap things up. Okay, this one is for you, Rachel. Is there I know that there are some, you kind of talked about a little bit, the different types of approved and not approved lighting, substitute lighting for sea turtle friendly lighting. Is there a specific brand that is the best or the most recommended for doing these transitions?
No. There's a plethora of manufacturers excitedly that started making sea turtle friendly lighting because it used to be a very novel type of item and it was really hard to find. And so many more manufacturers are starting to make sea turtle friendly lighting and there's so many more things available. So it depends on the application that you are using it in. So if there's a particular application to the person who asked this question, I'm happy to answer that. Tonya can 100% answer that. and we can kind of direct you on the right path as to what fixture may work for you, where you're trying to use it.
Awesome. Okay, thank you so much. So you guys, we're going to wrap up now. Thank you to Rachel, Tonya, and Erica for speaking tonight. We hope you'll be able to join us for our next Keep Florida Wild series webinar. This is about, it's titled The Breakdown on Heirs Property with Candace Spencer. It will be on June 22nd at 6 p.m. And I think the link to learn more and register just got put into the chat as well. If you guys have any other questions or mostly just questions about anything that we talked about tonight, you'll be able to, you're welcome to contact Alachua Conservation Trust or any of these panelists to answer any of those specific lighting questions or any other things that, or easement questions. Okay, so I think that's everything, and we will be wrapping up. Thank you so much for joining us. Thank you to our panelists again. I hope everybody has a great night.